testing ground to invite critical thinking about history with the help of colleagues that come across disciplines. And this is the case with this year's seminar as well, where we have, we're lucky to have a cross-disciplinary representation at this table, not only historians, but anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists join us for a discussion. I have two organizational points to make. Is that first, we've decided that we will not go around making individual introducing people who've come to the seminar, but instead we'll make presentations panel by panel, and there will be ample social time for conversation. And the second is this project underwritten by the grant of the Open Society Institute now includes a public outreach component, which is a TV net broadcasting, and we have a network of audiences that come together in different places, and we'll be able to observe the discussion that is going on in Kazan. And it's not only Russian network, but as it is true for the internet, many people can link up and listen to the discussion. The notion of difference and diversity has been the main focus of the project of New Imperial History, of thinking about the experience of empire and composite society in Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet space. And we always insisted that this question, this problem, should be framed comparatively. And we welcome here specialists, not only historians, not only specializing in the Russian Empire, but also on other empires, British, Ottoman, specifically. I'm not going to do a very long introduction for this seminar, but with the question of diversity, I think I want to introduce one note, and we will hopefully pursue that and add to this thread other questions. Many people complain that Imperio sometimes publish and initiates highly theoretical discussions that is very unusual for historical research and for historical inquiry. But I think, and that's the question that is very important, and I think we had a reason to insist on these theoretical discussions, because when thinking about diversity, we wanted to take it seriously and to reflect not only on empirical research, on historical contexts in which historians try to make sense of diversity, but also of the hegemony of the normative and authoritative discourses. And that link between empirical research and epistemology has been very important for us. How do we make sense of diversity if we don't break it into the ontology of national groups? One of the questions that we pursue. How do we bring social practices and cultural identities in a single analytical framework? How do we think about politics in the context of diversity, where the management of diversity is not only coming from the top, but also the problem of negotiating and renegotiating authority in a culturally heterogeneous space. To this we add exceptionalism, which is also a very rich thematic field to reflect upon. For historians, exceptionalism, and here I would be a little more provocative vis-a-vis specialists from other fields. For historians, exceptionalism has been the rule of the game since the German tradition of historicism. Historians always think that historical contexts are idiosyncratic and incommensurate and cannot be brought in a formal model, which is the habit and the rule of the game of social sciences. Of course, that has led to some of the scholarly dead ends and political tragedies, as we know again from the German experience, and the discussion about the Sonderweg and the special experiences, особый путь, have marred historical scholarship. So this is another layer in the thematic of exceptionalism. And the third yet connects to the empire, connects to the problem of ruling diversity, making exceptions, avoiding general rules, avoiding assimilation and standardization and homogenization of the polity. So all these questions are very important for us, and I would like everyone to be forthcoming in this discussion, even though, as we will find out, that usually happens in our workshop, that we have to translate that, and the notion of difference for a historian and the notion of difference for anthropology can be a different one. The notion of authority can be thematized differently. So I invite everyone to be cognizant of a cross-disciplinary representation of here and the fact that we go comparative with these questions history-wise. And I'm sure we will return to some of these questions. We have a structure of the panels, 25 to 30 minutes presentations, and then ample time for discussion.
More like 25.
20-25, that's been the rule now. And
we were originally told 15.
Wow. Well, that's the rule now. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce the first panel, and I suggest that we go paper by paper rather than bringing them together. Is that seems to be the case? And then I would like to introduce Stephen Howe, professor of history and cultures of colonialism, who works in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Bristol, comes from the UK. Stephen has contributed to Imperio with an interesting piece comparing taking the new Imperial history reader introduction and then trying to cross-read the thematic of the new Imperial history, how it is taken in the UK through the field of Russian history, making some provocative suggestions, thought-provoking, I have to say, suggestions, and thus starting a very interesting dialogue about the comparative situation of the new imperial history across different regions and different historiographies. The paper that Stephen present for our workshop and for our attention is Exceptional States and States of Exception.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. The agenda I'd proposed in the abstract, pre-distributed, would be impossibly over-ambitious, I think, even for a full-length paper, let alone for the 20 minutes maximum to which I shall try to keep. And perhaps also, even if it weren't for the case that I think I'm one of only two speakers in these sessions whose primary focus and expertise is not on the Russian or post-Soviet spheres. So in the time, I shall be only able to make a series of stark, sweeping claims across quite a wide range of general topics, perhaps indeed some of them also embarrassingly basic claims. Rhetoric's discourses, assumptions of essentialism, as our hosts remind us, have been near ubiquitous in the history and historiography of empires and in those of post-colonial and post-imperial states. Claims about first English, then British exceptionalism in historical trajectory have been surely among the most prolific and insistent of these, even arguably the most, an exceptional exceptionalism. They've taken multiple forms, separately and in combination, some of the claims, naturally, seeming more strongly grounded than others. They include assertions of uniquely early medieval state formation and bureaucratization, crystallization of national consciousness and identity, or even in some versions, an earliest modern-style political nationalism, though naturally we should note that all of these are claims of uniqueness vis-à-vis the rest of Europe, rather than truly global. There are arguments for an unmatched precocity in development of an individualist ethos, sometimes argued to account both for unusual economic dynamism, even in medieval times, for supposedly unrivaled bursts of scientific and cultural creativity, and for a pioneering entrenchment of the rule of law, of the rights of the subject, and a spirit of personal liberty. There are, of course, claims about England's historical priority in agricultural, commercial, and industrial revolutions, with their consequence in a longish innings as dominant world power. The word innings comes, of course, from the game of cricket, which reminds that actually one of the best cases for English uniqueness is in originating most globally popular organised games. And there is, perhaps more importantly, the assertion of unique longevity and continuity in institutions, especially monarchy and parliament. All these tend to be thought of as positive kinds of alleged exceptionality. More critical versions came, as one might expect, mostly from the political left, and most influentially the so-called New Left of the 1960s, in an argument most famously developed by Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn. They offered a damning account of British state development as creating and preserving a distinctively, indeed uniquely, ancien regime character. Control over the state in this argument had remained in the hands of a largely pre-industrial patrician elite. Britain's bourgeois revolution, initiated, quote, too early in the 17th century, was never completed, and there was thus conserved an anachronistic polity and culture, lacking equally in a properly modernising industrial bourgeoisie, a suitably class-conscious proletariat, and an intelligentsia with the capacity for holistic self-analysis. External expansion and global power made that perpetuation possible on this account, bequeathing a deferential and hierarchical politics, an eventually declining industrial base, and a complacent reactionary intellectual culture. Although it was sharply criticised right from the start, not least by a fellow Marxist, E.P. Thompson, and especially for its excessive claims precisely about supposed English historical uniqueness, arguments of this kind have had an enduring influence, certainly not only among Marxists or leftists. Varieties of British imperial exceptionalism have also been immensely powerful, and their enduring strength is indicated not least by their often implicit, taken for granted nature. In their positive variants, which were long dominant in the British historical profession itself, and have latterly been vigorously reasserted by historians like Neil Ferguson and Andrew Roberts, they take much of their substance from global extension of the more specifically insular claims I just mentioned. Their main upshot is that British Empire was overwhelmingly beneficial to the conquered as well as to the British merchants, investors or settlers in whose interests expansion had originally operated. Unlike its rivals in this vision, Britain's was a distinctively commercial empire and a uniquely liberal one. Britain's global rule, in Ferguson's words, enhanced global welfare. No organisation in history has done more to promote the free movement of goods, capital and labour, and no organisation has done more to impose Western norms of law, order and governance around the world. In this view, benefits bestowed included free trade, the rule of law, private property rights, honest and efficient administration, liberal democratic institutions and norms, investment in infrastructure and more. And it's sometimes added that the British were supposedly exceptionally reluctant imperialists, only intervening directly overseas when in effect forced to do so, where vital interests were threatened, or indeed when others begged them to do so, as in the widely used euphemism in formal nomenclature for some British colonies of protectorate. Part of the problem with this lies naturally in the presumption that imposing Western norms is self-evidently desirable and should be recognised as such by the colonised. But even leaving such value judgments aside, few would dispute that what I just sketched is at best a drastically simplified and rose-tinted view of the British imperial record. The benefits hailed were very unevenly spread and applied. Some carried a devastating downside. Free trade policies and a shift from subsistence agriculture to cash crop production for export brought famine in their wake, especially in India. The picture of empire as liberal, modernising, indeed uncorrupt, is strikingly one-sided. There was more archaism, autocracy, indeed corruption, than it admits. The notion of Britain's liberal empire rather overlooks the institutionalised coercion of colonial rule, the mobilisation of custom, the invention of tradition, the centrality of race to colonial projects, and thus the near inevitability of the colonised seeing alien rule as humiliation. British colonial rule didn't, as the affirmative tradition suggests, by any means systematically or everywhere spread the rule of law amongst its subjects or extend to them the legal rights enjoyed by Britain's own inhabitants. On the contrary, while white settlers in the empire usually had such rights, as well as enjoying substantial economic benefits from the imperial connection, most natives remained subject to quite separate, often usually far more punitive, legal codes. It's intriguing to compare these rhetorics of first English, then British imperial exceptionalism with notable others, that, for instance, of US history, or the more explicit, sharply focused German Sonderweg debate, and its more recent revival in the colonial sphere. I can only do so through yet briefer, more peremptory claims. But also, perhaps, one should note some more general considerations against a notion of exceptional for any imperial system in the modern world. I'll signal just three that seem to me especially important. First, the degree of cooperation or indeed interpenetration of imperial systems. So often, although a single, usually European nation's flag might be flying over a colonial territory, the reality on the ground is of much more mixed forms of rule, including significant participation, very often not only from elites amongst the colonised, but from other European powers. Second, a phenomenon which Ab Imperio indeed has explored, the degree of copying, imitation, what some here have called mirroring, between or among empires. the extent to which imperial systems often proceeded by conscious imitation and adaptation of other earlier or contemporary systems. And third, the degree of convergence in the practice of empire. Although, for instance, it's long been a commonplace amongst historians of the Western European empires that the apparently stark difference between British doctrines or philosophies of indirect rule and French ones of direct and assimilationist rule, this distinction is very blurred on the ground, that the practice of empire, in particular colonial settings, converges far more than the often rival theories of imperial governance would suggest. Debates over and critiques of American exceptionalism, no one here needs telling, are of long standing. They often, of course, involved assertion that the USA was a uniquely non-expansionist, or anti-imperialist great power. And even as the idea of American empire entered consciousness, first just over a century ago, and again revived in the last decade or so, a certain kind of exceptionalist thought persisted. It bears many similarities to, in some part derives from, the British imperial version. It admits that the United States has been an empire, but insists that it's been unique. While European empires were tyrannical and exploitative, American empire has been reluctant, liberal, beneficial and unselfish. Whereas European empires suppressed liberty and rights, America's aimed at spreading them. American interventionists, it said, moved quickly to transfer power to democratically elected local rulers, as supposedly in the Philippines or Haiti a century back, Iraq or Afghanistan today. What's most striking by contrast about discourses of German historical exceptionality, both in their older national and their more recent colonial variants, is by contrast their predominant negativity. As against those mostly positive images of British and American imperial exceptionalism, the famous Sonderweg thesis asserted that Germany's dramatic economic modernization was not matched by political or social modernity and liberalization. Old elites remained in control, and a reactionary traditionalism dominated the hierarchies of power. As everyone knows, the argument goes that these authoritarian values launched the First World War, destroyed the fragile democracy of Weimar, and enabled Hitler's rise to power. As will again be familiar, this line of argument, no less than those affirmative British and American imperial ones, has long been subject to searching criticism. But like them, I think it undoubtedly has still a strong purchase in the public mind. And very recently, there's been an intriguing reprise, a form of German colonial Sonderweg thesis. By some understandings, all imperialism, at least in modern times, is in some sense or some degree racial. Even if so, that of Germany was, so some recently argued, more intensely racialized than almost, if not absolutely, any other. It was also, it said, more heavily shaped by geopolitical arguments and assumptions that geography is destiny, as well as an eclectic mixture of ideas about conquest and rule drawn from both, say, British India and the American West. Can't resist here the familiar quotation from Hitler in 1941 that the Volga must be our Mississippi. Above all, very strong and direct continuities are asserted between late 19th century German colonialism and Nazi-era eastward expansion, between allegedly genocidal wars in German colonial Africa and the Holocaust, the road, in a much-used, also much disputed phrase, from Windhoek to Auschwitz. The ideas of continuity and uniqueness that so exercised historians of Germany itself in the second half of the 20th century are renewed among historians of empire. Here too, we find one aspect, the most contentious but certainly not the only one, of an important convergence between the scholarship on colonialism and that on genocide in history. As is increasingly often stressed in the latter, before the 1940s, by far most genocides in world history were in colonial settings. And it's sometimes suggested that colonial genocides were not fundamentally different from their mid-20th century European successors. They were somewhat less organised and bureaucratised. The role of the state, so it's suggested, may have been less obviously central, but variations rather than stark difference of type. So I think ever more genocide scholars argue in relation to the earlier colonial genocides and their parallels with, and indeed influences on, later ones within Europe. And here, perhaps, we return to the British imperial exceptionalism debate, but with a new twist. As I just noted, the assumption that there was something utterly and beneficially distinctive about the British Empire has been widely abandoned, among scholars at any rate, though not so much in the public mind. It appears now to many different from other European empires only in its size and longevity, again in degree, not kind. It's even been much questioned whether there really was, in any strong sense, a single British Empire. As Jed Martin said, on the test of central control, the empire, British, comes to look less like one monolithic structure, but rather a bundle of relationships between a strong power and a diversity of weaker territories. But the argument has been gaining ground that what was really most distinctive and globally transformative was not British-initiated conquest, nor British-centred trade routes, but migration and settlement. That Britain was unique in its creation of settler colonies, the cloning of British-derived societies across the globe, which it's increasingly often suggested, perhaps the most powerful and wide-ranging recent formulation is by my friend and close colleague James Bellich. This reshaped the course of modern history more dramatically than did empire or colonialism as such. It was also rather distinct from the latter in many ways, not least in that rather than being economically exploited or oppressed by the imperial centres, the Anglophone settlers were net beneficiaries from the relationship. Notions of a British world or Anglo world or Neo-Britons sometimes have varying implications, though, in their relationship with earlier conceptions of British imperial uniqueness. One of the biggest differences is whether or not the United States is seen as a full and central part of the story, whether Anglophone settler expansion should be seen essentially as two processes, one driven from London, the other from the eastern seaboard of North America, or one integrated process. Also, there are differences over how inclusive the conception should be seen as being. In the wider visions, not only did many non-white subjects of empire aspire to or bid for the notion of Britishness and the rights which it was held to imply, but Celts, including vast numbers of Irish, even very large numbers of Scandinavians and Germans became integral parts of a British or Anglo settler world. Here then we have a new argument for British imperial exceptionalism, one based not on the distinctiveness of British Empire as such, but on the uniquely transformative emigration and settlement patterns associated with it. And it's potentially a far more critical and conflictual one than the earlier versions. And this is so, I think, above all, because of the historical association I just alluded to between settler colonialism patterns not only of imperial violence, but of alleged genocide. It seems to me, we can expand this in discussion if you like, that in fact the case for the genocides of literally hundreds of distinct indigenous peoples across North America and Australasia under British settler world auspices is overwhelming. But these debates and developments, I think, also pose in renewed forms a further aspect of contention over discourses of exceptionality. That's, as I've already implied in relation to patterns of settlement, a need to question more than is sometimes done the notion of the exceptionalism of the colonial itself. This, I think, is found in particular strength in much recent literary and cultural history and theory. A powerful tendency to make assumptions about, rather than really investigate, what's distinctive or again exceptional about colonial situations or imperial states as against others. Here my complaints may be aptly directed mostly at the Anglophone and perhaps Francophone worlds of scholarship. I have to leave it to others to say whether excessive or undue assumptions about the distinctiveness, say, of colonial states as against other kinds of states are a problem also in the scholarship on Russian empire. But it seems to me that at worst, in some post-colonial and colonial cultural theories, a combination, for instance, of some overblown or misapplied Foucauldian and Lacanian theories, plus an overworked Caliban image, result, for instance, in finding resistance in all linguistic acts under colonialism, whereas such a claim is not thought apt or appropriate for non-colonial situations, even highly conflicted ones. Again, this is a point on which I could and would be happy to expand considerably, but I think I should move towards a close and leave that for discussion if people want. It's obviously in part just an open-ended question or set of questions and implied, or I've just made them explicit, negative judgments about tendencies that assume the distinctiveness of colonial situations, where in fact the empirical work to demonstrate that distinctiveness either has not been done or where it has been done by others has tended rather to be ignored. I also promised in my abstract to engage with yet another, more recent still, set of ideas about exceptionality. The rather sudden popularity in Anglophone colonial studies, at least, of ideas not about just about exceptional colonial states, but of states of exception, drawn from the work of Giorgio Agamben and behind him Carl Schmitt. I'd suggested that this is a development linked to the older arguments I just referred to by more than a coincidence of shared terminology, and that on the whole it's a rather negative development. I think time will allow me only to not develop that critique here, but offer just a few more, perhaps even more stark and unargued for claims. The recent vogue for notions of the state of exception for Agamben's ideas generally in colonial studies is on the face of it an oddity, since his own work quite simply says nothing about empire and colonialism. Indeed, some students of empire have noted that his sweeping assertions about the Nazi concentration camps as the hidden paradigm of modernity, the central emblematic truth of modernity's horrors. He rather forgot, of course, the Soviet camps in his focus on the Nazi ones. That this kind of claim could at least equally aptly be made about the slave ship or the plantation. For Schmitt, on the contrary, a case can be made for his being an interesting and rather neglected theorist of empire, with his nomos of the earth and notions of geopolitics. However, Agamben's ideas, so heavily indebted to Schmitt, on the state of exception, the nature of law and bare life, as well as his more Foucauldian conceptions of biopolitics, are suggested by a number of recent studies of colonialism to have a particular applicability in that field. Now, the Foucauldian notion of biopolitics, I take it, is familiar to most people here, and the notion of a historic shift in the idea of sovereignty roughly coinciding with the growth of modern imperial systems, seaborne imperial systems, from the 18th century onwards. It's widely claimed that all of this, the biopolitical conception, is especially and distinctively true of imperial states and colonial situations. I can only for now say that this view, I think, has not been shown empirically and is, frankly, to me, rather implausible in its more sweeping versions. As for Schmidt's and Agamben's conception of the state of exception, argued to be the hidden foundation of all modern state politics, and now again to have a particular applicability to colonial rule, that supposedly it shows there especially what Agamben calls an inner solidarity between democracy and totalitarianism. One can see why this has been found interesting by some students of colonial law and governmentality. I can see too its appeal in the age of the war on terror, of extraordinary rendition, Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, or indeed Britain's own emergency anti-terror legislation. But here too, the recent literature, I think, almost all fails either to show in any adequate detail how imperial rule was in this sphere unique or distinctive. Agamben's own work says almost nothing about any concrete historical situation except the Nazi camps, and as Mark Mazola and others have shown, is rather inaccurate even about them. Or, I think, done much to elucidate the relationship found, for instance, in the later British or French empires between a parliamentary rule of law in the metropoles and rule by decree or even terror in the colonial territories. Well, so I've made, especially now at the end, a set of not only sweeping, but almost entirely negative claims about various imperial and colonial exceptionalisms. What of the positive? Well, of course I do have some ideas on positive alternatives to some of what I've criticised, but they'll have to wait either for another day or for our joint discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Chair, since we believe that power belongs to the people, we should decide whether we have this burning feeling of immediately intervening and following on the presentation of Stephen, or we wait for Vera's paper.
We have only 2 papers in this panel. That's
right. Once again, now after.
Together? Yeah.
All right.
So then it is my pleasure to introduce Vera Tolz from the University of Manchester, specialist in Russian culture and Russian history. The most recent publication touches on the school of Orientalism and the politics of Orientalism in the Russian Empire. Vera has also written a book about nationalism in the imperial context. And today's presentation is with the question, how to avoid the trap of exceptionalism while accounting for Russia's specificities.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to take part in this workshop. And I think my paper actually follows quite well from what Steve has just said. And I'll start with some reflections on the meaning and utilization, in particular, of the term exceptionalism, particularly in the context of studying Russia. And I will then discuss one specific case from the history of Russian thought where certain specificity, rather than exceptionalism, can be claimed. And at the end, I'll make some suggestions about how we can account for specificities without falling into the trap of overstating exceptionalism, particularly of the Russian case. I think it's not always acknowledged explicitly that exceptionalism is both a discursive practice of societal actors and an analytical tool utilized by scholars who study those very actors. And indeed, discourses of exceptionalism have been employed very intensively by national and imperial actors in the past and in modern and contemporary historical periods. But also the concept of exceptionalism has been employed as an analytical tool in various fields of humanities. And this is despite the fact that, particularly since the 18th century, societies have become increasingly interconnected, and therefore the cases of truly exceptional or unique practices, as actually Steve just argued, are very rare. And it seems to me that there are several reasons for this widespread employment of the concept of exceptionalism as a tool of analysis, including, first of all, an uncritical acceptance of narratives articulated by the actors whose positions are supposed to be the object of our study. Then utilization of the concept of exceptionalism can be a reflection of a politicization of a scholarly field, and that is very obvious in Russian studies. Also the application of the concept of exceptionalism as a tool of analysis is a reflection very often of Eurocentrism or West Eurocentrism of scholarship, with a tendency to see the experiences of so-called West, which tends to be an idealized construct, particularly in the eyes, let's say, of scholars of Russia, as a norm. And in most cases than not, I think the utilization of the concept of exceptionalism as an analytical framework is quite problematic, because it becomes a tool of othering and, again in the Russian case, of negative stereotyping. And the arguments in favor of exceptionalism of a certain case are often based on the fact that a society is assessed against a particular model with universalizing assumptions which are, as Stevens is, not interrogated empirically. And the model itself not infrequently amounts to simplifications, failing to capture the whole variety of practices, discourses, and phenomena which are pertaining to societies which serve as a model. And an assessment against such a model often produces an analysis which amounts to establishing which features and processes are lacking or underdeveloped in a studied society. And missing then is an explanation of the processes which are actually taking place, as well as their causes and consequences. And we can sort of contrast this exceptionalism as a mode of analysis with what Maria Todorova called, in a well-known to Russian specialist debate on Russian Orientalism, a universalist approach, which basically amounts to the emphasis on a comparative study of a particular phenomenon. And it is indeed very helpful very often. But a universalist approach can have its own pitfalls. And there are, for instance, a number of examples of unnuanced use of, by scholars, of, for instance, modernization theory in explaining the processes and developments of the Soviet Union, which failed to capture what was actually specific to the Soviet experiment. And similarly to exceptionalism, universalist approach can become a discursive practice of various actors in a studied society. And a good example is an attempt of the contemporary Russian political elite in their discussions of Stalinist past to use modernization theory or discourse of modernization in order to normalize or relativize Stalin's terror. Exceptionalism is, in my view, a very strong term, and it implies sort of that a studied case does not fit with a particular universalist trend. And specificity is quite different from exceptionalism, as specificity does not preclude the presence of practices pertaining to a whole range of societies in a particular case. And indeed, the specificity is a universal phenomenon. When we look at a particular historical trend, practice, or institution, or even discourse, we see that there are always many specific manifestations within and between societies of the same or similar phenomenon. So in a way, the best historical study would combine approaches which allow to capture and explain specificity while acknowledging common or universalist trends. And this combination of approaches allows to explain what is actually happening in a given society rather than what is lacking, and also to strengthen the explanatory power of theories and models which often present Anglo-Saxon experiences as a universal norm. And now I'll give just one example of a case where the combination of both approaches is essential to capture the complexity of the phenomenon. And this is a case from the history of Russian thought, and specifically the academic study of the so-called Orient, again a very kind of simplifying construct, in Russia at the turn of the 20th century, but I'll put it within a pan-European context. If we look at history, what I prefer to call Orientology, so kind of academic studies of the Orient as opposed to sort of a wider field of Orientalism, we'll see that one of the most productive periods, which saw major theoretical and methodological breakthroughs against the backdrop of major empirical advancements, was the period very specifically from the 1880s and the 1920s. And we almost can call this period an intellectual revolution, which embraced, of course, fields other than Orientology. And significantly, the main intellectual advancements of this period were intimately linked with the questioning and, in some instances, the rejection of the concept of exceptionalism as a tool of analysis. And here I mean the questioning of the perception of exceptionalism in a positive sense of what at the time was uncritically called the European civilization, and the questioning of the universalizing assumptions of the European models. And this questioning was made possible by a series of unprecedented archaeological and textual discoveries about non-biblical ancient cultures, in which actually German and Austrian scholars took the lead. And the case of the Russian scholarship of this period is a good example where the complexity of the case could only be captured through adopting a universalist approach, seeing Russian intellectuals as participating in a pan-European dialogue, but also being sensitive to a specificity of the Russian situation, the nature of its contiguous empire, the collapse of that empire during the First World War, and the radicalism of the Soviet experiment and the specificity of the political and social dynamics in the 1920s. And of course I'll have to again simplify this case in order to make my points in the short time I have. Now, when we discuss the specificity of Russia's engagement with non-European societies, one has to be very careful of not falling into the trap of reproducing uncritically discourses of exceptionalism articulated by Russian actors themselves. And we have many examples starting from the early 19th century at least. And these were just figures of speech, part of a romantic discourse of national specificity. But we can claim, I believe, a certain specificity of the Russian case at the turn of the 20th century in terms of how a pan-European intellectual trend of questioning Eurocentric prejudices and emerging criticism of European colonialism was played out in the Russian context. And there was one particular field of Orientology in Russia at that time where attempts to revise established methodologies were particularly far-reaching, and that was the studies of Buddhism. This early 20th century critique of Buddhist studies in Russia was actually remarkably similar to the revisionist trends in the field that began in North America and Western Europe in the 1960s. And one needs to explain why Russian scholars asked very similar questions several decades earlier than their West European and North American counterparts. And there were two particular works of significance here, two books published by Fyodor Shcherbatskoy, a famous Russian Buddhologist, in 1903 and 1909, and then even more revisionist work by his disciple Otto Rosenberg, and many of these scholars actually were of non-Russian ethnic origins, quite a few were of German origin. And the questions, the issues which the scholars raised at the very beginning of the 20th century about Buddhist studies in Europe were they complained that ancient manuscripts interpreted with methods of classical philology were seen as always superior to the ideas of what they call native informants, so the learned Buddhists themselves, that classical sources were seen invariably as superior to the contemporary vernacular sources, and that Buddhism was presented, and I quote, as a homogeneous fixed phenomena, a unified worldview to which all adherents subscribed, even though it was in fact sort of very fragmented and pluralist, and that contemporary Buddhism was usually dismissed as a corruption of original Indian Buddhism of the past. And in order to sort of deal with these issues, Russian imperial scholars proposed what they called живой подход, living approach to the study of Buddhism, and particularly in translating Tibetan Buddhist texts, and on the territory of the Russian Empire, there were Buddhist communities specifically practicing Tibetan form of Buddhism. And it was possible to sort of initiate an interaction with representatives of Buddhist communities themselves in the context of early 20th century Russia, because it's a time of increased social mobility, and quite a large number of representatives specifically of Buryat communities in eastern Siberia came to Moscow and St. Petersburg higher educational institution to study. And here we have actually a parallel with the situation in the so-called West in the 1960s, when we have Tibetans fleeing persecution from the Chinese government to Western Europe and ending up in institutions of higher or interacting with scholars from the West in a very productive common intellectual encounter. And there were three particular people from these Buryat communities in eastern Siberia who started collaborating very intensively with Russian imperial scholars. Now, how unique was that collaboration, or how specific was this collaboration, better to say? Because we had earlier examples of collaboration. Всеволод Miller, whom Sergei Glebov studied, and it reminded me of a little bit earlier, but very intensively cooperated with representatives of communities in North Caucasus, particularly Ossetians, and his collaborators start publishing their ethnographic work already in the 1880s in Russian imperial journals. And here in Kazan, it's a very famous example of Nikolai Ilminsky, in some ways working together with representatives of non-Christian communities in the Volga region. So, and we have, of course, examples of British colonial representatives working together with Brahmins in India. Now, is there anything specific in my case? And in fact, it's, and what kind of a relationship it was, how does it fit with attempts to theorize the relationship between the kind of native informants and imperial representatives in a colonial context? And there are various models, but I don't have time now to elaborate on them. Yeah, I think in order to consider, and of course the Russian imperial Buddhologists themselves claimed this uniqueness of the Russian approach. Now, in order to assess their claim, we need to ask a few questions. How hierarchical, for instance, was the nature of their relationship with these Buryats? What these imperial scholars' own perception of the hierarchy of knowledge was? What exactly was the role of the Buryats in the intellectual project, which originated or initially conceived by the imperial scholars? And of course, this question about the hierarchy of knowledge and the hierarchy of the relationship is central to our attempt to make sense of the relationship between representatives of non-European communities and the between these Russian imperial scholars and various kinds of local informants. We'll have correspondence between Miller and the Assisians. We have correspondence between Ilminsky and representatives of non-European communities in the Volga region, and we have a correspondence, very rich correspondence between these imperial scholars, particularly the main names were Oldenburg and Sherbatskoy, and their Buryat collaborators. And I would argue that the nature of correspondence is very different, and even the language is different, because in case of Ilminsky and Miller, the people writing letters to them constantly use self-denigratory, self-deprecating language. They call themselves ничтожные люди, sort of insignificant people. They call their activities insignificant, ничтожные. Ilminsky's addressees to call themselves темные люди, sort of very uncultured, unenlightened people. And this self-deprecating language is absent, completely absent in the correspondence between the Buryats and Russian imperial scholars. And on the contrary, in particularly one of the Buryats, Tsibian Jamtsaran, and one can make claim that he was an exceptional person, is extremely self-confident, and he sort of almost pushes Oldenburg around and makes him do his bidding, particularly at the time of the 1905 revolution. And the Buryats, when they describe what they do, they use the expression «nasze общее дело», our common task. And they talk about «наша наука», our scholarship. And the divide between us and them, it is Sherbatskoy, Oldenburg, and their disciples, including the Buryats, on the one hand, and Russian or West European scholars who are not working at the cutting edge of research as they see them. And Jamtsarana in particular is very critical of various Russian scholars, particularly from the Imperial Geographical Society, who in his view do incompetent attempts to translate or publish Buddhist texts. And it's no doubt that these Buryat collaborators of the imperial scholars are not just collectors of the material, as we have is the case, for instance, with people who work from Assisia, who worked with Miller, but they are interpreters of the material. And I don't think we can make a particular case that we see here an appropriation of their work by the imperial scholars. Now, what about the hierarchy of knowledge? Now, the importance kind of European scholarly methods was accepted by everyone in this group, but in the case of Buddhist studies, the whole kind of trend of revisionism starts with Sherbatskoy and Oldenburg actually explicitly saying that the European philological methods do not work in the case of Tibetan Buddhist texts. You just can't make sense of them with the methods of the classical philology. And so this elevates immediately the status of local interpretative, Buddhist interpretative practices. And ironically, again, I don't have time to talk about it much, the most kind of interesting case of collaboration was the Institute for the Study of Buddhist Culture, which was set up in Leningrad in 1927, but it existed only for a couple of years. And that's the institute which actually had not just these Buryats educated in St. Petersburg University as members of staff, but lamas from Buryatia working as employees. And then they together fall victim to Stalin's purges, Sherbatskoy, his disciples, and the Buryats. And in a way, ironically, this institute is a kind of fulfillment of one of the first claims to Russia's exceptionalism, famous Count Sergei Uvarov's suggestion that so-called Asiatic academies should be set up in St. Petersburg, where lamas will take part. That takes place in Red Leningrad. Now, to sum up, when dealing with the history of ideas, universals, a certainly comparative approach, is absolutely essential in modern and contemporary periods. intellectuals articulated their ideas in a constant, in the context of a transnational dialogue. And I would argue that in the case of Russia, a pan-European dialogue continued even at the time of the Soviet Union's greatest isolation, even if in those periods of isolation the dialogue was not with contemporary debates or trends outside Russia, but with those of the past, and not through personal encounters, but through engagements with various foreign texts to which Soviet intellectuals still had access. I would argue that once we place a particular case in a comparative context, capturing similarities and common trends when studying an intellectual tradition of a set of ideas is easier part of the task. It is more difficult to account for genuine specificities explaining the causes and consequences. In relation to my case study of the early 20th century Russian Buddhology, I would not use the word unique in describing what happened in this field in Russia, even though Russian academics and their Buryat collaborators did argue in favor of uniqueness. There was, however, undoubtedly a specificity, and it was in the degree of questioning the hierarchy of knowledge and the stratification of labor in its production. Also, the degree of empowering Buryat scholars within the Russian academic context of the early 20th century was unusual for academia in Europe at the time. It seems to me that this Russian case challenges the position, particularly in its kind of crudest articulations, that a genuine dialogue between the European colonizer and a colonized subject was never possible, as the relationship was always dramatically unequal. I would argue that in the case of the early 20th century Russian studies of Buddhism, there was a genuine dialogue going on, and it engendered a particularly high degree of radicalism in the questioning of Eurocentric prejudice of scholarship, and then in the articulation of some methodological innovations, which in fact anticipated by several decades a range of conclusions of post-colonial scholarship in the West.
Allow me just for a couple of minutes to jump in again. And this absolutely fascinating distinction of specificity and exceptionalism offered by Vera is just one great example of cause why we really, why the expertise of literary scholars and sociologists and anthropologists absolutely indispensable here. We all represent different fields, so our own common language is some mental language, right, that we can all share and partake in. And story is a basic unit of expression for all of us. We have different stories, our different fields of expertise, really alien to others maybe, but what we should be looking for is some generalizations that we can reach departing from our unique, special or exceptional experience, and then get into some generalizing common grounds. And more specifically, I would like to suggest certain questions and approaches that we should be particularly looking into. Again, a very, very brief piece of empirical information. In the 1840s, late 40s, I believe, German language legal scholars did to discover, they made these two discoveries. Well, one of them had discovered the Russian peasant commune for the Russians in Russia. Unique, that for the century or more than a century would stand for Russian uniqueness and exceptionalism, right? At the same time, another German scholar went to Great Britain and did the same for the Brits. He made this then very awkwardly sounded phrase or self-government. He discovered self-government in the British medieval legal tradition, which was then re-imported into Britain and all over the world. Now everyone knew by the late 19th century that self-government, the basis for modern democratic systems, should be found the origins in the Great Britain. So Brits learned this and everyone else knew that. So about peasant studies, that Bill had on Russian case before moving them to India and Latin America. This was something also discovered by this by von Hausen. Right. The opposite example is this discussion between British federalist and anti-federalist of the late 60s, early 70s, the Seeley and Charles Dilke, about the concept of Great Britain. It was re-imported, or no, not, it was imported into Russia in the early 20th century as the concept, Great Britain, is precursor of the concept of Commonwealth. And Sasha did some study in this case. It was more Dilke and anti-federalist tradition that was represented by Struve. It was federalist Seeley's tradition more that Dilke's then represented by Slavinsky, who came out with the concept of imperial nation, political nation. It was underdeveloped and rather late concept, very revolutionary for Russia. So we have this, first of all, of course, this is about the interplay of these mirroring images and misunderstandings, creative misunderstandings, of course. And also this is about this opposition between exceptionalism and specificity. And who decides whether it's how to use this? And the question to anthropologists, how we actually apply, how we may put into practice this mental mapping of exceptionalism or specificity. And certainly a question to literary scholars. So how exactly we make this distinction, in which context between exception? When we decide that this is exceptionalism and Sonderwägisch thing, and when it's just specificity and it's just curious, but quite typical to other situations. So we're having this general gestalt in mind. Maybe we will return to cases presented by.
We have to. We have to.
And go beyond and heavily rely on our own research.
What I would suggest is that we will not divide. If somebody has a comment rather than a question, we can go and we can take rounds if there are questions. Tariki wanted to go ahead.
Would you like comments or questions?
I think.
Oh, it's all. I was very struck by the distinction between the actors and the analytical use of exceptionalism, and in that in conjunction with specificity. I think that's extremely useful. But it also made me think if what we're looking at here is not exceptionalism that is either self-reflective, specificity, I should say, that is either self-reflective or not. At some point, I think we find cultures, or maybe just elite, who actually begin to conceptualize their own specificity. And that might be the threshold where we have then a concept of exceptionalism. When that's then reintegrated into the analyst discourse, then we actually enter the problem with which we are now grappling. And there's one more point I would like to add, which is what do we do with the political system and the culture, like the Soviet Union, which I had to study, where the exceptionalism is all about being the most universal. That's the point. You're ahead of universal history. You're the first one to have actually entered the end of it, and you're working towards it. And in fact, you could probably make a similar case for the United States, although it would work differently. So there's a relationship here between it seems to me what I would call reflective specificity and universalism. And when you put those two together, there seems to be something. Maybe that's a specific modern type of exceptionalism that one could talk about.
The floor is open.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a handicap of the room.
You don't
Sorry.
see us here. I just wanted to
Another handicap.
throw in a couple of.
Could you stand up, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Sergei Levin from Imperio. I was really impressed and interested in this sophisticated presentations, and I just wanted to throw something in and see if we can reflect in further discussions on this issue. Vera, in your work, which I find really absolutely fascinating and in some ways breaking new path for Russian scholarship, in terms of articulating this position about the presence of essentially post-colonial critique in late imperial, early Soviet Russia, as well as in immigration. But the question for me is, how do we explain the different degrees of association with the colonial political power of those researchers, of those scholars? And this is something that is, I presume, I might not be correct in this, is different from the case of Great Britain. British colonial scholars did not have the same relationship with the centers of political and cultural power as many Russian scholars did. A lot of Russian ethnography was produced by people who were in political opposition to the regime or found themselves actually exiled or whatever happened to them politically. In the case of the Orientologists, some of them arrived in St. Petersburg, they didn't speak Russian, as Rosen's case was. So I'd be interested in hearing your reflection and Stephen's reflection on this problem of the relationship between the subjects of the production of scholarly power, of scholarly knowledge on empire and political power.
Ilya Kokulin, so I introduce you, representing the field of literary studies.
Can you just introduce everyone?
I don't know what I can represent.
I described you.
I would like to comment Vera's paper, if it's possible. It seems to me, and to comment Ilya's commentary. It seems to me that it may be analytically productive to distinct genetically mediated and typologically mediated similarities. They are. It is very difficult to divide them in real cases, but it may be moreover, it may be useful to do it because we have to. In the cases that you discussed, we deal with two kinds of processes. First of all, it's so-called imperial transfer, the transfer of concepts and practices of imperial governing. And the second is the homological similarities between different empires. For example, what is a question for me? It seems to me, under the influence of the studies by Andrei Zorin, Alexander Edkind, and Marina Yofis, that Sergei Uvarov, speaking about Académie Asiatique, he meant the project of empire of intermediators, the empire in which he would project the big army of intermediators which would connect and divide the government from different peoples of empire. And it would be interesting from this viewpoint to see what was the invisible purpose, suggested purpose of Buddhist research institutes that you explained to us. Thank you.
Comment and question. I found Stephen's presentation very interesting, and also because this analysis relativizes all the accepted classifications of empires, like modern, pre-modern empires, like overseas continental empire, and all sorts of classifications, probably including the kind of very basic classification between empires and nation states, and between modern and archaic polities and societies. So my question is for you and also for Vera, what do you think of that? And again, speaking about this, positive part of your presentation that we never got to listen to, I kind of anticipate that you will suggest kind of comparison of practices, and I would also add probably, based on our own discussions in our Imperio, of the kind of dynamic situations, like imperial situation, colonial situations that are contextual, and again, dynamic. We can really talk about specificities here. But this would also require, in my view, bringing in kind of larger concept, models or ideal types, like again modernity, colonialism, using them as ideal types that will give us this common language for comparison. Otherwise, we will, lost any possibility for the dialogue. And from here, I switched to Vera's presentation when Vera mentioned modernity. In a critical way, Soviet modernity is a kind of questionable concept. So I wonder whether we can actually stay without these larger models and this kind of ideal types.
I wonder, although you don't want us, of course, to reply constantly to everybody, whether I don't know if Vera does. I'm going to forget.
Or do you want to take a round of...
Unless we...
All right, let's break in here and then continue. Stephen, would you like to?
Would you want to go first?
Okay, I think Eric's first comment was excellent, that we have to be very reflective about specificity as well. It also can be discourse of practice rather than analytical tool, and we shouldn't kind of take it uncritically. And what you said about universalism as a claimed specificity, again, I think it is an excellent comment. I can only fully agree with you. Now, Sergei's question about the kind of different relationship between producers of sort of knowledge about the Orient in Russia and in Britain. Again, we have a kind of multiplicity of actors, of course, in Russian and British context. Now, in the Russian context, the presence of these political exiles is very interesting, and it's probably you don't have in the British case the same group of scholars. But I think, let's say, Nathaniel Knight, in his kind of contribution to critical debate, he overstated sort of the extent of alienation of many of these imperial scholars from the state, and sort of claimed Russian specificity on, or even exceptionalism on that grounds. Because, for instance, Oldenburg, Sherbatskoy, their relationship to the state, even though I presume they are, I don't know, more critical maybe of the Russian state than their British counterparts would be, they are in the service to the Russian state. They are very strongly kind of Russian patriots. So here I would say that the difference isn't very great. And indeed the main complaint about the difference with the Russian case and the British case made by these scholars is that the Russian government is not really particularly interested in scholarly knowledge and doesn't give enough money, while, let's say, the British government bases its politics on knowledge and gives more money for research. And then we have Max Müller giving a speech at the opening of what I understand was the predecessor of SOAS in London, and he claims that Russia is a model of government basing its policy on scholarship and giving enormous amount of money to research. Now, the fact that many of the scholars I look at, in one way or the other, come originally from the imperial periphery, I think is important. And I think it is important in the case of not just the scholars, but intellectuals, cultural figures, artists of this turn of the 20th century. It's the period of enormous mobility in the Russian Empire, and you have people, outsiders basically, coming into the center. And they start questioning, as an outsider, they see what the problems are better than people within the system. And that gives sort of influx of various people from the peripheries, give enormous dynamism to the Russian cultural scene of the early 20th century. That probably, again, you don't have in the British case kind of the same influx of outsiders. And then in the 1920s, of course, this context is extremely important in terms of generation of revisionist ideas. And you have basically the production of new methodological breakthroughs right across various disciplines in Russian literary theory, for instance, in particular. And again, we have a lot of people, Jewish scholars who previously couldn't advance so much in academia, coming in with their own ideas. And of course, in the 1920s, the immediate post-revolutionary context in Russia, what we see that basically societal norms, all societal norms are questioned. Sort of the world which people know falls apart in front of their eyes, and they realize that what they regarded as kind of natural is in fact socially constructed. So not surprisingly, you have all these theories about gender being a constructed phenomena, age being a constructed phenomena, being formulated in 1920s Russia. Family relations, yeah, exactly. And then a very good point about intermediation. Within the context of this Budology of the early 20th century, the idea of intermediation actually most vocally formulated by the Buryats themselves. And the greatest promoter of this idea, precisely of Buryats as intermediators, is a person who is not a scholar, but Dargiev. You might have heard of him, and he was actually an advisor to Dalai Lama. And he indeed sort of coexists in different cultures, yeah, in Tibet, in Buryatia, and he's very much connected with the Russian then Soviet government, and he is probably a spy for various imperial forces. And so he introduces the idea of particularly Buryats as these intermediators between East and West. And he's also very well connected to Buddhist scholars in Japan who also come up with this idea of intermediation, because it's the time of Japan engaging with the West. Yeah?
And Western science.
And Western science. And it seems to me that this Buddhist communities as intermediators, the idea is actually taken up by Oldenburg and Shcherbatskoy from Dargiev, rather than vice versa. Yeah? And there are all sorts of ideas which, let's say, it's very clear from even correspondence that Oldenburg and Shcherbatskoy pick up from their Buryat collaborators. Now, we have, I think, a problem a little with some examples of post-colonial scholarship, where there is a kind of assumption that there is a kind of genuine culture of non-European community, which then is corrupted by the kind of European influences. But there is I think, never a kind of isolated, genuine culture. Any kind of cultural production in the past, and certainly when we talk about the 20th century, exists in a kind of a larger sphere, and there is a constant intercommunication. And here is a very good case of this intercommunication. And as I say, the idea of intermediation is actually championed more in this case by the Buryats than by Russian scholars. And then with Marina's point about the larger models, I think actually we, in a way, need larger models because they allow for a comparative sort of framework. But a larger model can't explain everything. And if you just say that, as has been the case with some works on the Soviet Union, that, okay, it's actually very important to indeed acknowledge that certain sort of processes in the Soviet Union, certain policies in the Soviet Union, is a very extreme form, a radical form of processes which have taken place kind of in the world more broadly. But if we stop at that actually tells us very little. So I'll stop now.
Would you like to?
I'll try to be very brief. On the exceptionalism of universalism, or the exceptionalism of proclaiming oneself the most universal, suggested that this is a Soviet model, which seems very clearly true, suggested that there are certain parallels with the United States. And I'd add that there are prior British world discourses of this kind. The notion that first England, then Britain, and then this British world, or in the term that's most often used to capture a revival or continuation of this train of thought now, Anglosphere, is unique precisely in being supposedly the unique point of origin of, and supposedly the best exemplar of, a set of universal values, for which a semi-synonym is often held to be simply the notion of the West. And here, a universalist kind of particularism is articulated, perhaps most influentially in contemporary terms, thought of as an Anglosphere, of one that supposedly unites Britain, the United States, and Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc. And apart from actually using the word Anglosphere, the best clue to whether people are thinking in these rather uncritical positive terms about the nature of the Anglosphere is the way in which they always reverentially invoke the name of Winston Churchill, sometime in the very first few sentences. On the relationship of scholars to power and the differences between British and Russian history, of course, as Vera said, in relation to one side, one could say just as much from the other. There is an enormous complexity here. There are clearly differences. There are important émigré scholars involved in Britain, and one of them, perhaps one of the most influential, Max Muller, was just mentioned. But I think it would be right to say that they're relatively few in number. And even when the great influx of influential émigré scholars comes to British intellectual life, which is above all refugees from Nazism, refugees from the Russian Revolution, are rather few, though one can think of one or two who make important contributions more to domestic British history. Then strikingly few of that, as it were, 1930s generation of émigrés takes an interest in imperial affairs or becomes an imperial or colonial historian, anthropologist, etc. And as a fascinating sidelight on that, one could think, for instance, and I mention it because it's an interesting microcosm of so much. If you think the immediately post-colonial University of Ghana, the newly independent, first independent black African state from the late 1950s onwards, you have for a time a quite extraordinary mixture of people. You have the great Irish historian, former diplomat, and you could multiply his roles endlessly, Conor Cruise O'Brien, as Vice-Chancellor of the university. You have everyone from the venerable African-American sage W.B. Du Bois, then at the end of his life, through to the nuclear physicist and former Soviet spy Alan Nunn-May in the physics department, to Hitler's former pilot and unrepentant admirer Hannah Reich. Perhaps slightly more to the point, you have two immensely important figures in Anglophone social theory, an émigré scholar first to Britain and then on to Ghana, Norbert Elias, and at an earlier stage in his career, the very influential anthropologist Jack Goody. And you have much of it taking place in ways that were not published or apparently even recorded. A really fascinating debate against this newly independent backdrop between the resolute Eurocentrism of Elias's civilizing process approach and the more and increasingly would-be global visions that Goody is developing. Now, you have a few émigrés. You have some kinds of intellectuals whose relationship, thinking about empire, whose relationship with state power is pretty consistently oppositional, of course. The most influential figure in the British history of thinking and writing about empire in that vein would be J.A. Hobson, from whom, as many of you will know, Lenin, amongst others, took many of his ideas about empire. In terms of those intellectuals who are directly working for the imperial state serving power, they are certainly fewer, and I think this is perhaps the biggest difference that was being pointed to earlier. Because I think you don't have an equivalent in Russia or almost quite anywhere else of the intensity of the notion of the generalist and indeed the amateur, both in political and historical writing and in governmental administration, that's so important in modern British history. In the notion that one should be able to turn one's hand to anything, to beware of the specialist, to beware of the too highly qualified. So in the colonial service itself, there's a very strong tendency, of course, to want to recruit products of the major private schools and of the old universities. But as Sir Ralph First, the man who for decades was in charge of colonial service recruitment, said, beware of the man with a first-class degree, that is. We want people who have a good education, who are preferably sportsmen and so on as well, but we don't want them to be too clever. We don't want people with first-class degrees. And of course,
will certainly disagree.
Yes, indeed. And in the sphere of academia and influences on imperial history, another figure who was mentioned earlier, Sir John Seeley. In some ways, he glories in the notion that he's an amateur. So you have amateurs, you have you have a few émigrés, you have a few out-and-out critics. You have, of course, political intellectuals in the sense of practicing politicians, or occasionally senior civil servants, like the Mills, father and son, who are also influential writers. Charles Dilke is another obvious example, a frontline practicing politician who is also a very influential political intellectual in relation to empire. And finally, on this, you have a continuing flow into both academia and other spheres of educational products of the colonies, overwhelmingly the colonies of white settlement themselves. And possibly the most important figure amongst those, the scholars who have a direct influence on imperial policy making, is Sir Keith Hancock, Australian-born and educated. And there's obviously a wider story here of colonial universities, especially Dominion universities, as clones of British universities. And finally, quite another story again, in some ways much more of a direct influence on shaping policy, but policy of particular colonial governments rather than of the imperial centre, is naturally the role of the anthropologist as agent of or aid to colonial government. I won't go on further about that. Last for now, in response to Marina, Of course, I don't want actually to collapse together all distinctions between types of empire, or even that between empires and nation states. The result would either be a kind of conceptual anarchy or an ultra nominalism. Neither of them are particularly helpful routes analytically to take. In fact, I was thinking more of particular, more specifically focused modes and areas of scholarship and modes of inquiry where there is often not enough hard and explicit questioning about the specificity of the colonial. To take just one example amongst a potential multiple, deliberately to take an example that relates directly to the subject of a later presentation. Colonial medicine has been a huge scholarly growth area in recent years, but at least in the Anglophone world, all too little of it has asked, in the words of an excellent recent review essay by Megan Vaughan of some of this work, what's colonial about colonial medicine? Or in anticipating not enough of scholars in the field ask the kind of questions that I take it Anna is going to be posing to us in precisely that regard. Last of all for now, and to revert to the exceptionalism, universalism, etc., I think one should beware perhaps of yet a further syndrome, which is the sort of reflexive negative discourse of exceptionalism, which I flirted with self-consciously in wondering near the start whether Britain was repository for an exceptional exceptionalism. I think there may well be a tendency, which I catch echoes of in various quarters, to say, we are exceptionally bad in the solipsism and extremism of our discourse of exceptionalism. And perhaps I was deliberately flirting with that in relation to British history. Perhaps some others here may be in danger of it for Russian history. I don't know.
But yeah, if I may quickly follow, and I'll reopen. I've seen Alessandro and others, but I want to quickly here inject a note about the specificity of the historical language of talking about peculiarities, uniqueness, or specificities. And that is, the British always stand out in the language. If you look at the German debate, what was the Sonderweg? It was vis-a-vis the British. It was the British, as they discovered later, that was exceptional to the rest of the European continental history, and then it was discovered to the rest of the world's history. But the language, I mean, the British case here is very important because in historiography, the very grammar of specificity has a referential valence vis-a-vis Britain. It happened so that this British experience was thematized to an extent that in other European historiographies, this language has always, you can see it now, but the latent layer in there is that means not unlike the Brits. So Alessandro, you go, Sergei, and
okay, I'm trying to make the usual.
And if we have 15 minutes between us and lunch, so everyone should be aware.
My question is for three of you, or both of you, including yourself, is when we go beyond our deconstruction, I mean the historiography or the colonial attitudes, constructions of what an African was or what a Russian was and so on, my problem is how to go beyond deconstruction or historiography analysis and try to reconstruct without falling into a new kind of positivism. In other words, how do we explain how it worked beyond this? And for this, I have the impression for these first talks that the patterns of time that we use are not the same. In other words, there are patterns of time coming from history with complexities, coming from anthropology, from sociology. Every patterns of time is legitimate, but the answers we have are exactly not the same, as Marina suggested. How do we compare with which categories? For example, do we put historical contingencies in our stuff or not? First. Second, when we say about specificities, do we think in the long durée or not? Much often people associate specificities to long durée. For example, the role of the state in Russia, something like this. The role of pizza in Naples, whatever you want. It's the long durée. But how do you put contingencies when you make a comparison in all your stuff? Is this contingencies the same for a sociologist and a historian? I'm not that sure. For example, just a couple of cases that you mentioned in your talk. First, for example, why British and Britain, we should consider the Britain case and so on. This comes for some political analysis, from economic histories, but at the same time, I can be legitimate to compare Russia to India, even if it's not in the main historiographical trend, and if it's not. So how do we put together? And for example, when we introduce Britain, all the time the British historiography, at least for economic history in which I work, they focus on a specific interval of time, and we need to specify this. If we take the 19th century, Britain can be pertinent. If we take 19th, 20th, 18th, 16th century, Britain is no more pertinent because over the long durée, you can might say that China is doing better, or even France, than Britain. So, if we don't specify the patterns of time on which we work, and with which we work, we are in an ahistorical position. To me, we just compare everything with everything. And how do we avoid, this is a question for both of you, ex post legitimation with historical explanations? Because much often we find, because there was this, and this, then I have this. I'm not convinced of this, precisely because there are different elements that we might define as a specificity. I don't know if it is, I want to demonstrate after, but the explanation is something different. It's just not because we have this A, B, and C that you have D. This is always taken, because in Britain you have individualism, after you have this. It's the after which misses, precisely as in colonialism, with the Sonderweg, just the last point, is precisely this. When we enter into who says what, why, and when, it's great that after 45, this genocide and all the stuff became a political problem. Of course, in the end of the 19th century, we were not the same problem with colonialism. Nobody cared about the human rights, and they were defined after the Second World War. Human rights were a different stuff before, and the colonial people were integrated. So we can compare if we want, but we are in a specific pattern framework. We don't care about time. I mean, we have a colonial state in the 19th century, which was completely different for different reasons, of a state after 45, because in between you have different practices of the state. So if we get out from the economic, and I agree with you, that colonialism and even Russian colonialism was, or Gulag, whatever you want, was much more political than economic, and nobody took great benefits from this. We moved from the economic to the political side, and it's okay. But is the political control in England, the notion and practices in England at the end of the 19th century, the same as in Soviet Union in the early 50s? What meant political control and displacing population, for example? If we don't answer these questions, the comparison between, our culpability or guilty vis-a-vis the Africans and the displaced population of the Soviet Empire are just, in an empty sky.
Thank you. So there was Ilya and then Sonia. Oh, no, there was Sergey. I'm sorry, there was Sergey.
Great. And Alain is also online. I'm not a historian, so I will try to kind of dispense with details and context. And I want to ask a general question. I'm trying to think about the nature of the intervention that we are trying to make this morning, like with this idea of exceptionalism and universality. In anthropology, we usually don't use this kind of words. You could correct me. And we talk about somewhat different things like structure, ecosystems, and difference, and those kind of things. And what I was trying to understand today, I was sort of listening carefully, and it reminded me a lot, actually, the debates that took place in the end of 1960s and early 70s with all these structuralists who are becoming sort of post-structuralists and trying to understand sort of to what extent system is repeatable, and if it is repeatable, so where does it take? And like all you need to kind of recall is there is a difference in repetition, and of course like repetition is never repetition, it's a denial of the norm, and as a result sort of you never have sort of a system that is perfectly the same as a system that was produced elsewhere. Or like in Vera's case, I think it's just a very good example of the model that Bourdieu does in his distinction. Again, the same system with the same idea, namely that sort of we have a particular system of predispositions that get sort of realized and reproduced and sort of institutionalized through a system of distinction, right? So the question then to ask is like sort of what are we trying to do sort of analytically, theoretically, and epistemologically? Sort of are we trying to embrace finally sort of the post-structuralist moment and to say that, well, yeah, sort of Empire provides us with this kind of nice language where we can finally sort of establish a system and its repeatability, right, in kind of like sort of, I don't know, subversive and unfinalized form? Or are we trying to do something else? So where are we going with all this?
Good question. Everyone has own answers.
Okay.
I made a terrible mistake as a chair. In fact, we have 12:30, so we can have a new breath for this discussion. I apologize for this. So there was, if I'm not mistaken, Sonia, and then please indicate, yeah. So we'll go. Okay, we'll go round here. Okay, please.
Sonia Newman from Simon Fraser University, and I'm sort of both an anthropologist and historian, so I have a bit of a difficulty with thinking about that there are questions that historians ask that anthropologists need to have them answer, or vice versa. Kind of disciplinary specialization of answers, I think, is maybe not the most fruitful way to go. But I have a question for each of the presenters that has to do with this distinction between specificity and exceptionalism, which I find very productive. So for Vera, you mentioned at some point that Oldenburg said something about how these German or Western philological approaches to ancient Buddhist texts don't work in the case of Tibetan Buddhism. And you were saying that as an example of sort of a claim to specificity, but isn't it more actually, if it was really phrased like that, isn't it more as a claim to exceptionalism, saying, well, you know, these approaches may work to some other forms of Buddhism, but they don't work in the case of sort of our domestic Buddhism or the kind of Buddhism that we know. So I wanted to ask you if you can tell us more about, I mean, did these Russian scholars actually launch a critique, sort of a more general critique of these Western approaches that would really be comparable to the critique of the 1960s, or was it more a case of, you know, well, you know, these German philologists do what they do in Germany, but we are going to do something else over here. And for Stephen, I found it very interesting what you were saying about Agamben and how it's applied in colonial studies, which I'm not very familiar with those particular applications. But sort of within the context of this debate about exceptionalism and specificity and all of that, and within the context of your critique of people sort of making these claims that colonial states are a priori different from any other kind of state, couldn't it be that these kind of approaches to states of exception and biopolitics, of which I'm also, you know, by no means a fan or an advocate, but couldn't there actually be a chance to bring together critiques of sort of different sorts of states? I mean, because the way that I take it, Agamben meant it as sort of a general critique of the way states exert power. So that could be an opening to questioning, you know, so is there a difference between the power exerted by a colonial state in the colonies and, you know, what other state governments do? And that, I think, that bringing together might potentially be productive to the Soviet case and to other such cases.
So Victor was second, and then we will, what I suggest that we still gather there are some general comments and there are questions. So I'd like the panelists, those who gave papers, to keep a list of questions addressed to them. And then we'll have, going around the discussion following these two threads. Please.
Yeah. Actually, I want to give some comments on, primarily on what Vera Tolz presented here. I'm really fascinated with this approach because, as an anthropologist, I know that we don't have, there are no anything like a pure culture. Culture is partly as a result of intercommunications and intercourse. And we are really very interested in people through which culture represented itself. And it's very, very important, especially now, especially at the time of globalization and mass migration and migrantophobia especially. It's very important to understand the nature of this intercommunication, and especially to learn something about people who actively participated in this sort of activity. So well, it's good to talk about Buryats, but also there are a lot of examples of this sort of intercommunication, as Shotanov among Kabardians, for example, or Kostaki Tagurov among Ossetians, or Jurkan Malikhanov among Kazakhs. And you know, and they were intellectuals, but they were intellectuals just in between cultures, and not only intellectuals. I would recall Dersul Zola and his communication with Arsenyev. So the problem is whether they were just assistants or just subalterns, or they were mediators between cultures. I would prefer the second approach. And they communicated not only with the Russian scholars, they intercommunicated with foreign scholars as well. As you know, many foreign scholars visited Russia. I mean, archaeologists, ethnographers, historians, and they communicated with local people. There were a lot of information which moved both sides. And this is not only a Russian problem. I would go further, and I would remind the way Neo-Hinduism spread over through Vivekananda or Aurobindo Ghosh, you know, all these great names. And this is a way culture was, culture moved not from the center, from, you know, great empire, but it was just movement back from the colonial world, or what they call colonial world, back. And people teach each other and learned a lot from each other. So I guess this is a very productive approach, and because I would prefer to go from human being to institution rather than from institutions to human being, because institutions are realized through the activity of human being, and sometimes we are we generalize too much, talking about social groups or ethnic groups or classes, because they every time they consist from various people with their different state of mind and different social experience and different way of understanding the world. So it's well now it's a new trend in, I think it's postmodern. We live in the period of postmodernism, and we need thinking more about particular human being. And the last, well, Gulag is pretty economic, I would say. It might be integrated into economic structure and economic history. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Alain, please.
Great. So I will ask my question, and maybe then you can guess whether I have any discipline. Yeah.
And whether you should care whether you have
So I'm listening to both the comments, the talks, which are very interesting, and coming up with a sort of a hybrid question in a way. So I was thinking, Vera, while you multiple forms of rule interpenetrate. Right? So there's this way that this region in the historiography, but less in our own particular forms of endeavor, have been understood as a space over which empires have competed for influence. And I'm thinking specifically here in the 1880s of what little I know but have heard about what was called the Great Game between India, Germany, and Russia, right, for this kinds of points of entry into other former empires. So then I started thinking, well, it could be very interesting to contrast and compare someone like these scholars who were going to St. Petersburg with travelers like Sarat Chandra Das, who was exploring on behalf of the British in Tibet, and to see how could we think about these intercommunications not just along the lines of connection up through the hierarchy, right, in terms of relation to government, but also in relation to the competitions and the kinds of mirrorings that seem particular perhaps to conflict situations, to military kinds of conflicts, like and economic conflicts. So how could you understand this not just within the line of what's happening inside the empire, but what's happening between them at that moment?
Thank you. And there was Andrei Kushko. Was one more hand in here, but probably at this moment we will break and give the presenters a chance to reflect and return. I beseech everyone to also try to respond to Sergei's question, a very general framing of what are we doing. Please.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief. First, I have a question for Professor Howe. A question and sort of my own inquiry. And I found your overview fascinating. Of course, of all these discourses and counter-discourses on the nature of the British Empire. But I wonder whether this is not also linked to the, well, if I may call it that way, post-imperial syndrome in Britain. That is, at different moments after 1945, we see different approaches to this either beneficial or non-beneficial nature of the empire, and I think there is a correlation between these scholarly approaches and the way in which British intellectuals or elites try to cope with this post-imperial syndrome. And of course, if we compare the outcomes of imperial disintegration, for example, in Britain, France, and Russia, we can also account for these different approaches to exceptionalism. And also, for example, I'm thinking of David Canadine's response to the dominant discourse on race in his famous book, Ornamentalism, where he consciously, in my thesis, when I read that was my impression, where he consciously tries to complicate the story, but also to show the very multi-layered nature of British imperialism in connected to his contemporary situation. At least, and the more particular question I would ask is whether you could, I don't know if you have time, but whether you could elaborate on this question of the importance of British settlers, the global impact of British settlement, as opposed to the settlement practices of other European empires like the French and the Spanish. So how is this argued? Why is the British Empire so exceptional in its settler policies and in its worldwide success, if we take that if we take this argument as a valid one? And then just some sort of reflection, maybe also on Vera's paper, connected to this use of specificity, exceptionalism, and all these notions in the framework of modernity. Because here I think the Soviet case is quite interesting indeed, because we can frame it very differently if we use different categories. And the categories of exceptionalism and specificity can also be problematic. In order not to be too abstract, I would refer to two cases. First, Alexander Etkind, whom I always find very interesting and thought-provoking, but who, especially in his earlier well-known treatment of Russia's internal colonialism, it seems to me did overstate his case somehow, in that he actually collapsed, or made a very almost a comparison which amounted to equality, actually, between what a colonial state does outside its borders and what a state can do inside its borders. So what do we do with the colonial situation? Is there any colonial situation if cultural distance equals colonialism, simply speaking? And the final reference I would make is to James Scott. I don't know to what extent he would fit in our discussion, but when thinking about the Soviet case and the insistence on, or the category of high modernism that Scott uses, which actually he applies quite problematically, I think, to the Soviet case, because this is maybe the weakest point of his book in a way. Again, in my view, he gives a one-sided analysis of the Soviet case. But still, how would it be possible to integrate all these practices of social engineering that had their place in European modernity as such generally, in the case of the Soviet system, where one can speak about, on the one hand, the paroxysm of modernism, but on the other hand, of a very problematic attitude to European modernity. So, I mean, this is a question for me as well. So maybe we could comment on this.
What I would suggest to do is probably turn to our presenters and then have a little concluding exchange on the big question of how do we reflect on the framing of the question as it emerged from this general discussion.
Gosh, I think if you'll forgive me, I shan't attempt for now to respond to the earliest and biggest questions about method and indeed about disciplinarity, since any attempted response would be extremely long and rambling and of no more value than anyone's and everyone else's opinion here. I think the issues raised there will continue to resonate through the next couple of days' discussion anyway. I think the only point I'll make there, purely sort of personally, is perhaps reflecting that British tradition of the generalist come amateur to which I was critically referring a little while ago. But I tend to be perhaps excessively, but it often feels to me liberatingly sceptical about how high the walls between disciplines should be, sceptical about the extent to which in many of the spheres about which we're speaking there really are such distinct disciplinary specific methods of working, etc. On the issue of discourses of human rights, their relationship to genocide, and the suggestion that we have post-45 a human rights discourse, and prior to that, and in particular in relation to the colonized world, we did not. I would qualify that, indeed qualify it quite heavily. I think there are important precursors of modern campaigns for and discourses of human rights in and in relation to many aspects of the colonized world prior to the Second World War, though undoubtedly they're strengthening in the later stages of the European colonial era, we can speak of it as such, contributes significantly to the dismantling of the seaborne empires. But even at earlier stages, there has, for instance, in the British case, been an increasing interest and body of historical work recently on humanitarian networks across the empire, groups of activists widely scattered in space seeking to coordinate action in classically, most famously, most powerfully, the anti-slavery cause, especially in the earliest years of the 19th century, but later such issues as Aboriginal Australian or New Zealand Maori rights. or, of course, in the case of the most widely cited and currently most debated, especially among German historians, colonial genocide, the alleged genocide of the Herero and Nama at the very start of the 20th century. Protest against this in Germany was substantial. I think we could actually say that it was stopped. The genocide was stopped by protest in the Reichstag, in the press, to some extent within the Wilhelmine administration itself, saying that what von Porter is doing is unacceptable on humanitarian and human rights grounds. On whether ideas from Agamben might be a good route to a wider, not colonially specific critique of states. Well, in a sense, of course, as I take it, that is his main intention. The political implications of his arguments are often described broadly accurately, I think, as anarchist. He is clearly anti-statist and concerned to question or collapse the alleged distinctions between democratic parliamentary forms and authoritarian or totalitarian forms. But in the colonial sphere, the sort of example I just gave of these partial effectiveness, though it did, of course, come too late for most of the Herero, of protest in a relatively free German media at the start of the 20th century, in a relatively democratic Reichstag, etc. I think that kind of example could be seen as something of a point against the usefulness of the excessively sweeping and ahistorical Agambenian theses. And in terms of philosophical influences on colonial studies often seem to point in a somewhat similar political direction. Agamben is here sometimes seen as a kind of supplement or successor to Foucault, and although I would have many criticisms of uses of Foucault in colonial studies as well, I think they do at least, that his influence does at least overall tend to point us in more historically grounded and discriminating directions, I think. Gosh, I can't take up even half the points made. The great game, really what Germany wasn't actually a major player, as I think was implied. This is primarily conceived of as a Britain against Russia contest, sometimes direct, they never come into armed confrontation, more often indirect diplomatic and strategic competition over control of India's northwest frontier and, of course, control of Afghanistan. And multiple arguments have been made about continuities between that 19th century great game and more recent events in Afghanistan. Some of them are even good arguments. I think probably the most important point I draw from it, though, relates to something I was mentioning. It's more about the cooperation of empires. That although we can point to instances like that of intense imperial competition, we can point elsewhere to sort of flashpoints, a Fashoda or an Agadir, where it looks as though colonial powers might be on the brink of fighting each other. Actually, they always pull back. After Napoleon, I think one could say, Napoleon I, European powers don't fight each other in and about colonies. They don't fight each other in colonies until 1914-18, and even then they're not fighting about colonies. If it had been left to the administrations in German, British, French, etc., Africa to decide, they'd never have shot at each other then. So I think the story here is much more one of inter-imperial cooperation, even between Britain and Russia, even at the height of the Great Game, than of competition or conflict. The whole notion of the lateral interconnections, again, shorthand it has to be, yes, it's fascinating and important both within and between empires, very often captured in much of the current literature in the language and the metaphors of the network, which actually I suspect is now being slightly overused. But in relation, there was an allusion made to people, to networks amongst the colonized, amongst anti-colonial agitators, activists, intellectuals and artists. Well, lots of interesting stuff at the moment focuses on this. If one's interests are primarily in the literary and cultural spheres, for those sorts of networks, I'd point in English to the recent work of Elika Burma or of Robert Young, for instance, and use that bibliographical allusion as a shorthand, trying to argue it through. I should stop. Post-imperial syndrome and the relationship between the contemporary politics of that and trends in historical writing. Gosh, I feel not only I, but friends and colleagues rather older than me who've spent our entire careers engaged in exactly that dialogue, and I don't know how I could begin in a minute or two to summarise it, so won't try. Canadine's Ornamentalism is rather a slight book, really. Its strongest point, I think, is about stressing the roles of traditionalism in aspects of British imperial governance and rhetoric and symbolism, as against an excessive stress in some other literature on colonial modernity. But there are many weaknesses, not time to develop, nor is there time to develop, and it would really, I'd be deriving from others, arguments about the why of the specificity of Anglo-settledom. Again, perhaps we can return to that. Last of all, James Scott and high modernism, or his picture, for instance, of Tanzania has been criticised by specialists as very flawed, just as is his picture of the Soviet Union. In relation to our imperial themes, my main line of questioning would be to say his central thrust is to stress how, if you like, his rulers and experts are flying too high above the ground of local conflicts and complexities to understand them or get them right, and hence their disastrous failures. The kinds of colonial policymakers, administrators, planners that I've come across in the literature from many different times and places, they make sometimes similar looking mistakes, but usually they're much closer to the ground, closer to the detail of those local conflicts and partisan within them. And very many of their failings and even disasters, I think, come more from that than from the almost opposite fault that Scott talks about.
Yeah, again, I won't attempt to address all the points. Just a few words on this major question asked by Sergei. I think that I found sort of the purpose of this workshop much clearer than you, and this is because I think the questions were formulated by historians, so they are much more meaningful to me. And so if you hire a historian, then the question of sort of how to deal with indeed the exceptionalism as a discursive practice of the actors, not influence what we do, not determine what we do as kind of external observers of the scene, is very, very meaningful. And then again, very specifically in relation to Russia, but it applies to every empire. So you can produce numerous kinds of case studies, yeah, of kind of imperial engagement with a particular sort of group, and this interaction which Victor very rightly mentioned. The engagement is never one way, it's both ways, and how we kind of bring these different cases together, what we do with this multiplicity of cases, how can we theorize and maybe produce models on the basis of that. Is this at all useful to try to generalize? To what extent we should generalize?
I guess what I'm questioning is, like, sort of the fundamental investment is still deeply structuralist, right? Therefore, sort of variations become very attractive, precisely because there is a certain negative concern with the structure as a conceptual tool, and therefore sort of like you want to dilute it and sort of multiply, right? That's what I'm sort of asking about. Like, well, okay, so having done it already, but several decades ago,
No, Sergei,
No, it's both.
The discourse.
It's not structure.
It's not.
It's not.
No, it's both.
I asked a question.
Yeah. All right. So I suggest we shouldn't all jump on Vera's time. Please.
Okay, and in this connection, I just link I think Alexandra's point and also Andrei's very specific question about Atkin, for instance. Now, it's of course every phenomenon we look at, we can look at it from different perspectives. We can ask all sorts of very different questions, and it's therefore extremely useful to have this interdisciplinary dialogue, because obviously an anthropologist will look at the material very differently from a historian. And I just a side comment: I find anthropological work on post-communist Russia the most interesting. It actually tells me much more than any sort of certainly more than political science research about what's going on in Russia today. But I think what is very important is that to use the certain questions require particular tools. You can't answer any question with a tool from whatever discipline. And I think the problem with Atkin's work is precisely that at times inappropriate methods are used to answer questions. And there are certain historical questions which require a historical analysis, which require the understanding of the historical context. And you can't really sort of produce very meaningful analysis rather than maybe thought-provoking comments. You can't understand the phenomena if you approach a historical question with tools, let's say, of literary theory. And therefore, I think you found, and I did as well, the case overstated. And we have, I think, a similar question, a similar issue more general with post-colonial studies, that very often an issue which requires its historization, it requires the understanding of historical context, is commented upon or judged from our contemporary standpoint. And this has its value, but the value is actually very limited. And we should remember that our own today's perceptions will also be critiqued in the future. Now, Victor's comments, I actually fully agree, but again, I would here say that we need to historicize the cases, and I think Velikanov's case is very, very different from this Buryat's. He is basically an isolated individual who finds himself in ultimately, or very talented individual, indeed this intermediary, but he finds himself in the context of imperial scholars, and he can't cope with that because they see him as different, he sees himself as different. He ultimately doesn't, and I haven't looked at his sort of works, but I can't imagine him talking about Nasha общее дело, Nasha наука. He's really an outsider through and through, and not surprisingly, he drinks himself to death and dies very early. While with this Buryat, it's a specific context, and in which they found for themselves a very, very comfortable niche, and this has to be accounted for. And there is a difference with, let's say, Lubinsky and more close historically cases, and Miller, and it's not, again, a coincidence that both Miller and Ilminsky are older than Oldenburg and Shcherbatsky. They're a different generation, and the relationship is different from what we have now at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, with a kind of how Buryat and Mongolia and Tibet were imagined, and indeed, sort of my actors are very conscious of the struggle with Britain, and indeed, Oldenburg makes this claim that British sent their pundits to Tibet but we Russians can do better with the Buryats. But at the same time, there is clearly a sort of discourse about Buryatia and Tibet, particularly Buryatia, the discourse which I would call the kind of attempt to normalize these areas. And this is new. And to fight the attempt to exoticize them. And so when these imperial scholars mobilize to defend the Buryat clan system against the imperial government's reform, they compare Buryatia with Switzerland. Interesting. Now, to what extent, another question, to what extent, let's say, Oldenburg's comments are specific to Tibetan Buddhism, or to what extent it's much more general criticism of Oriental studies? Oldenburg progressively in his career was becoming, his criticism was becoming more and more and more general. And this criticism of Buddhology is not just in relation to Tibetan Buddhism, although I think the process, the criticism starts with a Tibetan case. But it then becomes the criticism of the whole field. And actually, Oldenburg himself was a specialist on India, so he was more a specialist on Buddhism in India, which he then sort of applies to the Russian Buddhist communities. But then, of course, in the late 20s and early 30s, Oldenburg published this sweeping criticism of Oriental studies in Europe, in Western Europe, which I, in my book, sort of, I don't know, convincingly or not, argue indirectly influenced Said via Arab scholars who studied in the Soviet Union in the late 50s. I'll stop at that. We're almost ready to have lunch.
Yeah, well, I would say I would say that it was a great panel. We still have 4 minutes. I wanted to say a few things with this regard. That I think what is going on in here, and the idea is that we have a particular moment in historiography where we're all in favor of a global view and a global history, and the understanding of the peculiarities and incommensurability of different historical experiences is there. And that comes in this particular moment, historically speaking, that we need to talk seriously about how do we evaluate and compare. Because you can go global without, and therefore very banal, right? You know, that won't tell you about the richness of each experience. We can go very local and not, tell a story, or will not be able to translate. So this is a historical point. Now, the second thing, and that what I missed in this discussion, although there were a couple of instances of that, is the single continuum with which we see the languages of articulation of peculiarity, exceptionalism, and the political balance of them. I mean, we still have it. I mean, okay, there was a post-structuralist debate, but that problem is still with us. It's part of the identitarian politics. It's part of the assertion of original spheres of influence, the concept that we've almost forgotten. Now it's interesting, if you look at the grammar and the language, what people would say translating exceptionalism and difference, they would say особый путь. The Sonderweg is translated as особый путь. And what is interesting is that this comes etymologically from the root of the self, because особый — это о себе, особа, the persona, talking about oneself, individuality, and exceptionalism comes to be, very individuality, personality, and exceptionalism comes to be in one semantic cluster, which I think is very interesting to reflect, because that connects then not only politics and exceptionalism, but modern subjectivity, and the way we talk about, different layers of historical experience in this regard. So I think it is important. I think it is important to reflect on those things, while at the same time we are always in a paradoxical situation. While at the same time we can't really deny singularity of certain experience, right? And then Stephen has introduced the whole question on the genocide, but there are people who are saying that if you flow the category of genocide endlessly, then you end up with no rigorous criteria to discriminate and differentiate phenomena. So this is, I think it's both the political balance of the analytical language and the true analytical nature of the challenge that we're dealing here. And I think they were demonstrated by the two approaches, one which is citing the empirical case and the difficulties of how do you actually explain it and translate it without making it banal again, and the review of historiography that suggests of how important this translation and the political layer and the balance of this language. This is only the beginning. I think we had a very fruitful start. What I suggest is that we do for the future is that we do keep these questions, and probably will break my suggestion. My humble suggestion will be, from the experience of this panel, is to have first questions to the actual papers and then more general comments for the second part, so that we are not confusing the two threads and not going along them simultaneously. On that note, I would like to thank our presenters for a wonderful job, and everyone who participated.